Nothing is wrong. At least, nothing you can point to. Your life hasn't fallen apart. There is no immediate crisis, no dramatic loss, no clear reason to explain the tension you feel when things finally start to calm down. In fact, from the outside, it looks like you're doing better. You're more stable, more functional, more in control. You wake up, you go through the day, you handle what needs to be handled. And yet something feels off. Not painful exactly, just unfamiliar, uncomfortable, almost as if your body doesn't quite trust the silence. You might have expected relief to feel lighter, warmer, easier, but instead, it feels strange, awkward, even unsettling. And that confusion often comes with a quiet question you don't say out loud. Why does feeling better feel wrong? This reaction isn't weakness, and it isn't ingratitude. It's not that you want to suffer, or that you don't appreciate improvement. It's that your system has learned to function under pressure, and calm feels like lost structure. When you've spent a long time navigating stress, tension becomes familiar. It gives your mind something to organize around, something to manage, something to do. Struggle creates clarity, tells you who you are and what's expected of you. So when that struggle fades, even slightly, your mind doesn't immediately relax. It hesitates. Because improvement doesn't just remove pain, it removes the framework you've been using to survive. And that can feel disorienting. You might notice it in small moments. A quiet evening that feels oddly empty. A weekend with no urgent plans that leaves you restless. A sense of calm that arrives and then quickly turns into discomfort. Your mind starts searching for something to fix, something to worry about, something to hold on to. Not because you enjoy stress, but because stress has been your reference point. For a long time, being tense meant being alert. Being alert meant being responsible. And being responsible meant being safe. So when the tension loosens, your system doesn't interpret that as peace. It interprets it as uncertainty. This is especially true for people who are used to functioning well under pressure. People who learned early on that staying composed, capable, and self-controlled was the way to move forward. You don't fall apart easily. You adapt. You push through. And that strength becomes part of your identity. So when life starts asking less of you, when the urgency softens, it can feel like something essential is missing. Not because you need chaos, but because calm doesn't yet feel like you. There's often a subtle fear underneath this experience. Not a dramatic one, a quiet one. The fear that if you stop bracing yourself, something will go wrong. The fear that if you relax, you'll lose your edge. Or worse, that you won't know who you are without the constant effort. So instead of enjoying relief, your mind stays watchful. It scans for problems. It tightens slightly, keeps you alert, just in case. This isn't self-sabotage. It's conditioning. Your nervous system learned that stability came from vigilance, not ease. From managing, not resting. And because of that, improvement can feel strangely unsafe at first. You may even notice a sense of guilt, not because things are going well, but because you're not doing anything to deserve that calm. As if ease must be earned through effort. As if peace requires proof. So when it arrives quietly, without a clear justification, it feels suspicious. This is where many people turn against themselves. They think something is wrong with them. That they're incapable of happiness. That they're broken in some invisible way. But what's actually happening is far more human than that. You're standing in unfamiliar territory. Your mind is adjusting to a version of life where survival isn't the main task anymore. And that transition from coping to being can feel deeply uncomfortable. Because coping gave you direction. Being asks you to trust. If any of this feels familiar, you're not alone. And more importantly, you're not failing. You're learning how to exist without constant tension. And that learning curve deserves understanding, not judgment. Stay with this thought. Because what feels like resistance is often the beginning of something quieter and far more real. Let's slow this down. What you're experiencing is not a character flaw. It's not emotional immaturity. And it's not a failure to appreciate progress. It's a learned response, one that makes sense when you understand how your mind and nervous system adapted over time. When someone spends months or years operating under constant pressure, the system adjusts. It becomes efficient, alert, and highly functional. Stress stops being an interruption and starts becoming a framework. You don't just experience tension. You organize yourself around it. Tasks give shape to the day. Responsibilities give direction to the mind. Urgency gives meaning to action. Over time, this state of internal pressure stops feeling abnormal. It becomes the baseline. For many people, especially in cultures that value independence, competence, and self-regulation, this adaptation is often praised. You learn to handle things. You learn to stay composed. You learn to push through discomfort without slowing down to examine it. And that ability becomes part of how you define yourself. You're the one who stays functional, the one who doesn't fall apart, the one who keeps going. So when life becomes calmer, not perfect, just less demanding, your system doesn't immediately recognize that as safety. It notices something else first. The absence of tension. And absence, to a brain trained in vigilance, doesn't feel like peace. It feels like uncertainty. The human brain isn't designed to seek comfort. It's designed to seek predictability. What's familiar feels safer than what's calm but unknown. For a nervous system shaped by pressure, tension is familiar, calm is not. This is why moments that are supposed to feel relaxing can feel strangely uncomfortable. A quiet evening with no obligations. A weekend without urgent plans. A stretch of time where nothing needs immediate attention. On the surface, these moments look like relief, but internally, they can trigger restlessness, a subtle tightness, a sense that something is missing. Not because something is missing, but because your mind is no longer receiving the signals it has learned to rely on. Under stress, your role is clear. There are problems to solve, standards to meet, expectations to manage. Calm removes those signals. And without them, the mind starts searching. It scans for potential issues. It replays old concerns. It looks for something to fix, improve, or prepare for. This isn't because you enjoy worry. It's because worry has been a form of orientation. For a long time, being tense meant being prepared. Being prepared meant being responsible. And being responsible meant being safe. So when that tension softens, the system doesn't relax, it hesitates. This is where many people misunderstand themselves. They assume the discomfort means they're incapable of peace, or that they secretly thrive on stress, or that they're somehow broken. But what's happening is far more mechanical than that. Your nervous system learned to associate alertness with stability. Ease hasn't been mapped yet. And anything unmapped feels risky. This pattern is particularly common in people who value self-control, people who take pride in staying composed, people who learned early on that managing themselves was the way to move forward. Self-control becomes more than a skill. It becomes a value. You don't just have discipline, you are disciplined. You don't just regulate emotions, you identify with being regulated. So when calm arrives, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like losing structure. Without constant effort, who are you? Without something to manage, where do you place your attention? Without tension, what keeps you grounded? These questions rarely appear as clear thoughts. They show up as sensations. Restlessness, irritation, a low-level anxiety without a clear cause. You might notice that you feel uncomfortable when you're not doing something productive, or that you feel a vague sense of guilt when you rest without a clear justification. As if rest must be earned. As if calm requires proof. This isn't a moral failing. It's conditioning. In many environments, especially professional or achievement-oriented ones, value is closely tied to output. You learn, often implicitly, that effort equals worth. So when effort decreases, worth feels temporarily unstable. Your mind tries to restore balance by reintroducing tension. It tightens. It stays alert. Keeps you slightly on edge. Not to punish you, but to protect you from uncertainty. Because uncertainty feels more dangerous than exhaustion, when exhaustion is familiar. Another important layer here is identity. When you've spent a long time coping becomes who you are. You know how to survive pressure. You know how to function under stress. You know how to stay composed when things are demanding. But you may not yet know how to exist without bracing yourself. So calm feels empty, not because it lacks meaning, but because you haven't built a sense of self inside it. This is why improvement can feel destabilizing. It doesn't just remove pain. It removes the role you've been playing. And roles, even exhausting ones, give orientation. Without them, the mind asks a quiet but unsettling question. What holds me together now? This is often where control steps in. Control becomes the anchor that replaces tension. You stay mentally vigilant. You monitor yourself. You keep an internal grip on things. Not because you don't want peace, but because peace feels undefined. Letting go doesn't feel like rest. It feels like exposure. So instead of relaxing, you hover. Instead of settling, you stay alert. Instead of trusting calm, you supervise it. And that supervision keeps the system from fully settling. It's important to understand, this isn't self-sabotage. You're not consciously resisting improvement. You're not afraid of happiness. You're adjusting. Your nervous system is transitioning from survival-based organization to something quieter and less structured, and transitions like that are uncomfortable by nature. The discomfort isn't a sign that calm is wrong. It's a sign that calm is unfamiliar. Think of it this way, for a long time, tension gave you a sense of direction. It told you where to focus, how to move, and what mattered. Calm asks a different kind of question. Not, what needs to be handled? But, what do I attend to now? And that question doesn't have an immediate answer. So the mind does what it knows how to do. It looks for effort. This is why people often feel the urge to create problems when things are going well, or why they feel uneasy when life becomes too quiet, or why slowing down can feel more threatening than staying busy. It's not because something bad is about to happen. It's because your system hasn't yet learned how to orient itself without tension. And that learning takes time. What you're experiencing is not a rejection of peace. It's the process of recalibrating an internal system that has been organized around effort, control, and vigilance. And that brings us to an important question, one that will shape everything that comes next. If tension has been the way you've stayed connected to yourself, what happens when tension is no longer required? Once you understand that tension has been your internal reference point, another layer begins to reveal itself. Not all at once. Quietly. It shows up in the way you monitor yourself. In the way you stay mentally alert, even when nothing is happening. In the subtle sense that you're always being watched, even if the only one watching is you. For many people who have lived in survival mode for a long time, calm doesn't remove pressure. It redirects it inward. When external demands decrease, internal supervision increases. You start paying closer attention to your thoughts, your reactions, your emotional states. You check yourself constantly. Am I doing enough? Am I wasting time? Am I letting myself slip? This isn't anxiety in the classic sense. It's vigilance. And vigilance feels responsible. For a long time, staying alert kept things from falling apart. So the mind assumes that loosening control would be dangerous, even when there's no evidence of that. This is how self-control quietly turns into self-surveillance. You don't just regulate yourself. You watch yourself regulate. You don't just rest. You assess whether you're resting correctly. You don't just feel calm. You question it. And that constant internal observation creates tension of its own. Not loud tension. Subtle tension. A background hum that never fully turns off. You may notice it when you try to slow down. Your body relaxes slightly, but your mind stays active. You sit still, but something inside keeps scanning. It's as if calm is allowed, but only under supervision. This pattern often develops in people who learned that mistakes were costly, that losing control had consequences, that staying composed was not just helpful, but necessary. So self-control becomes a form of self-protection. But over time, protection becomes pressure, because there is no off switch. When you are both the one being controlled and the one doing the controlling, rest becomes complicated. You're never fully at ease, because part of you is always checking. This internal surveillance creates a very specific kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of doing too much, but the exhaustion of never letting go. You may sleep, but not feel restored. You may pause, but not feel settled. You may slow down, but not feel safe. Because safety has been associated with alertness for too long. Another consequence of this pattern is a subtle form of guilt. Not dramatic guilt. Quiet guilt. The kind that appears when you're not actively earning your place. You may feel it when you rest without a clear reason. When you enjoy something without having earned it. When you're not being productive, useful, or improving. As if ease requires justification. As if calm must be deserved. This guilt doesn't come from a belief that rest is wrong. It comes from a system that learned to associate worth with effort. So when effort decreases, worth feels momentarily unstable. The mind responds by reintroducing pressure. It reminds you of things you could be doing. It points out inefficiencies. It creates a sense of urgency, where none exists. Again, not to punish you, but to restore familiarity. Because familiarity feels safer than freedom when freedom is uncharted. Over time, this internal pressure can become so normalized that you don't even notice it anymore. You just assume this is how being alive feels. A constant low-level tension. A quiet sense of responsibility. An internal demand to stay on top of things. And when that demand briefly disappears, it can feel unsettling. You might feel strangely empty, or disoriented, or disconnected. Not because something is missing, but because the pressure that structured your inner world has momentarily loosened. Pressure gave shape to your attention, told you where to focus, kept you anchored. Without it, the mind has to face something unfamiliar, open space. And open space can feel uncomfortable when you've never learned how to inhabit it. This is where many people mistakenly believe they are afraid of calm. That's not quite accurate. What they're actually afraid of is not knowing how to be without effort. Effort has been the organizing principle, the thing that made life feel coherent. So when effort fades, coherence walls. You may notice this in your relationships as well. When things are stable, you might feel restless. When there's no conflict to manage, you might feel oddly disengaged. When nothing needs fixing, you might feel unnecessary. This doesn't mean you need chaos. It means your sense of purpose has been tied to managing difficulty. And purpose doesn't disappear overnight just because conditions improve. It needs to be redefined. But before that can happen, there is often a period of discomfort. A period where the old structure has loosened, but a new one hasn't formed yet. That in-between space can feel deeply unsettling. You're no longer fighting, but you're not yet resting. You're no longer bracing, but you haven't learned how to soften. So the mind fills the gap with control. It tightens internally. It stays vigilant. It maintains pressure as a way to stay oriented. This is why people often say they don't know how to relax. It's not that they don't want to. It's that relaxation feels unstructured. And unstructured space feels risky to a system trained in vigilance. Another subtle effect of this pattern is emotional distance. When you're constantly monitoring yourself, it's hard to fully inhabit your experience. You observe your emotions instead of sinking into them. You analyze rather than feel. You stay slightly removed. This can create a sense of disconnection, not just from others, but from yourself. You're present, but not fully here. Engaged, but guarded. Again, this isn't a flaw. It's a survival strategy that worked for a long time. But strategies that protect us in one phase of life can quietly limit us in another. The key point here is this. What feels like inner resistance is often inner protection. Your system isn't trying to block peace. It's trying to make sense of it. And until it learns a new way to orient itself, it will default to what it knows. Control, monitoring, effort. Understanding this changes the conversation. Instead of asking, "Why can't I relax?" a more accurate question becomes, "What does my system need in order to feel safe without tension?" That question doesn't demand immediate answers. It opens a different direction, because the goal isn't to force yourself into calm, or to eliminate vigilance overnight. The goal is to gradually teach your system that ease doesn't equal danger. That rest doesn't mean collapse. That silence doesn't mean loss of control. And that learning happens slowly, through experience, through consistency, through moments where nothing bad happens even when you're not bracing. But before that learning can take place, something else needs to be addressed. There is often a deeper fear beneath self-surveillance. Not just the fear of losing control, but the fear of losing identity. If effort has been the way you know yourself, who are you without it? That question is rarely conscious, but it shapes everything. And that's where we need to go next. Because behind the discomfort with calm isn't emptiness. It's transition. And transitions always feel unstable before they become grounded. There is a deeper fear beneath the discomfort with calm. Not the fear of boredom, not the fear of emptiness, but the fear of losing the structure that has been holding you together. When effort has been your main organizing force, letting go doesn't feel like relief. It feels like stepping into something undefined. Control has been doing more than managing your behavior. It has been shaping your identity. You know who you are when you're focused, disciplined, and alert. You know how to function when there's pressure. You know how to navigate life when there's something at stake. Effort gives you a role. So when effort is no longer required, the question isn't just, can I relax? It becomes, who am I if I do? This question rarely appears directly. It shows up as hesitation, as resistance, as a subtle tightening when things begin to feel easier. For a long time, control has been your way of staying intact. It helped you move forward. It helped you stay composed. It helped you avoid falling apart. So the idea of loosening that grip can feel threatening, not because control is pleasant, but because it's familiar. Familiar systems feel safer than unknown ones, even when they're exhausting. This is why many people don't fear chaos as much as they fear softness. Chaos is something you can manage. Softness requires trust. And trust feels risky when your system has learned that vigilance is what keeps things stable. Letting go of control isn't experienced as freedom at first. It's experienced as exposure. Without constant monitoring, who ensures things don't go wrong? Without internal pressure, what keeps you moving? Without effort, what keeps you from drifting? These questions create a quiet panic. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. So the system responds by holding on. It maintains control not because it wants to restrict you, but because it doesn't yet know how to feel safe without it. Another layer of this fear is the belief that control equals responsibility. Many people equate letting go with negligence, as if relaxing means not caring, as if easing up means becoming careless, lazy, or unreliable. So control becomes a moral stance. You don't just control yourself because it works, you do it because it feels right. And that belief makes it even harder to loosen your grip. Because now letting go doesn't just feel unsafe. It feels wrong. This is especially strong in people who learned early on that being dependable was essential. You became the reliable one, the composed one, the one who holds things together. That role often came with approval, respect, a sense of being needed. So control didn't just keep you functional, it gave you value. And value is hard to give up. So when calm arrives, it doesn't just challenge your nervous system. It challenges your self-concept. If you're no longer the one who manages everything, who are you? This is where fear quietly intensifies. Because identity loss feels more dangerous than exhaustion. Even if exhaustion is painful, it's familiar. Identity loss feels like disappearance. So the system chooses the lesser-known discomfort over the unknown risk. It chooses tension over ambiguity, control over openness, effort over trust. This choice isn't conscious. It's protective. Another important aspect of this fear is the belief that if you stop pushing, you'll fall apart. Not because you're weak, but because pushing has been the way you've stayed intact. You might worry that without pressure, your motivation will disappear, that you'll lose direction, that you'll become passive. So control feels like insurance. It keeps things moving. It keeps you together, keeps you from slipping into something you don't recognize. But this belief often overlooks something important. Control helped you survive. It doesn't have to define how you live forever. Survival strategies don't automatically dissolve when conditions improve. They persist until they're consciously updated. And updating them takes time. It requires experiences where you loosen control slightly and nothing bad happens. Where you ease up and remain intact. Where you rest and don't collapse. But before those experiences can accumulate, the fear must be acknowledged. Not fought. Not judged. Acknowledged. Because fear doesn't respond to force. It responds to safety. And safety isn't created by demanding calm. It's created by showing the system that calm doesn't equal loss. Another subtle fear beneath control is the fear of being ordinary. Effort often provides a sense of distinction. You're the one who pushes harder, who endures more, who holds themselves to higher standards. So letting go can feel like becoming average, like losing edge, like blending into something less defined. This fear is rarely spoken, but it's powerful, because effort has been a way to feel someone. So easing up feels like becoming no one. But this fear confuses intensity with identity. You are not your tension. You are not your effort. You are not the pressure you apply to yourself. Those were tools, not definitions. Still, tools used for a long time begin to feel like parts of the self. So separating from them feels like loss. This is why the idea of just relaxing feels so unrealistic to many people. It's not a simple behavioral change. It's an identity shift. And identity shifts are destabilizing by nature. They involve letting go of what you've known before you fully know what comes next. That in-between space feels uncomfortable. You're no longer who you were, but you're not yet who you'll become. So the system tightens control to avoid staying in that space for too long, because ambiguity feels unsafe. But here's the key point. Control has been a bridge, not a destination. It carried you through a phase where vigilance was necessary. But bridges aren't meant to be lived on. Eventually, they must be crossed. Letting go of control doesn't mean abandoning responsibility. It means redefining it. Responsibility doesn't have to come from pressure. Stability doesn't have to come from tension. Meaning doesn't have to come from struggle. But these truths aren't accepted intellectually first. They're learned experientially. Through moments where you soften slightly and remain grounded. Where you release a bit of control and stay intact. Where you rest and don't disappear. This learning happens slowly. And it requires patience with the part of you that is afraid. Not because that part is weak, but because it kept you safe for a long time. The discomfort you feel when you consider letting go isn't resistance to healing. It's loyalty to what worked before. And loyalty deserves respect, even when it's time to move on. Which brings us to the final movement of this journey. Because letting go of control isn't about becoming passive. It's about learning a different way to stay connected to yourself. A way that doesn't rely on tension, or surveillance, or constant effort. And that transition, from control-based identity to presence-based stability, is where everything begins to change. But it doesn't begin with action. It begins with allowing yourself to imagine a version of you that is still intact. Even when you're not holding everything together, there is no single moment when control disappears. No clear line where effort ends and ease begins. What usually happens is quieter than that. Control loosens in small ways, often without you noticing. A thought you don't chase. A tension you don't immediately correct. A moment of stillness you allow to exist without supervision. At first, These moments can feel uncomfortable, not because something is wrong, but because something is different. For a system that learned to stay safe through effort, presence feels unfamiliar. It doesn't announce itself as relief. It doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives as space. And space can feel unsettling when you're used to being held together by pressure. This is where many people try to rush the process. They look for techniques to fix the discomfort, strategies to force relaxation, ways to silence the vigilance. But forcing calm only recreates control, just in a different form. The shift that actually matters happens when you stop trying to replace effort with another demand. When you allow yourself to be present without needing to improve the moment. This doesn't mean you abandon responsibility. It means you stop using pressure as the only way to stay connected to yourself. Responsibility can exist without tension. Awareness can exist without surveillance. Care can exist without self-punishment. But these ideas don't settle all at once. They settle through experience, through moments where you don't tighten, when nothing is required of you, through moments where you let calm exist without asking it to prove itself, through moments where you stay, even when there's nothing to manage. Over time, your system begins to learn something new. That ease doesn't mean collapse. That stillness doesn't mean loss of control. That silence doesn't mean disappearance. It means presence. Presence isn't passive. It isn't careless. And it isn't empty. It's a different kind of engagement, one that doesn't rely on urgency to feel real. When you begin to trust presence, identity starts to shift. You're no longer defined solely by how much you endure, or how tightly you hold yourself together, or how consistently you stay alert. You begin to recognize yourself in quieter ways. In attention, in responsiveness, in the ability to remain with yourself without needing to perform. This shift doesn't erase the strengths you developed under pressure. Your discipline doesn't disappear. Your reliability doesn't vanish. Your capacity to act remains. What changes is the source of stability. Instead of coming from effort, it begins to come from continuity. From knowing that you remain intact, even when you're not bracing. There may still be moments where the old patterns return. Moments where tension creeps back in. Where control tightens. Where vigilance feels necessary again. That doesn't mean you failed. It means you're human. Learning a new way of being doesn't mean erasing the old one. It means expanding your range. You can still focus when needed. Still act when required. Still respond to challenges. But you no longer need to live there. You begin to discover that calm doesn't require permission. It doesn't need to be earned. It doesn't need to be justified. It simply needs to be allowed. And allowing something unfamiliar always feels risky at first. But risk isn't always danger. Sometimes it's transition. The discomfort you feel when you stop holding everything together isn't a warning sign. It's a sign that you're stepping into a way of being that doesn't depend on pressure to exist. That doesn't mean life becomes effortless. It means effort is no longer your only anchor. And that changes everything. So if calm still feels strange, if ease still feels uncertain, let that be part of the process. You don't need to force yourself into peace. You don't need to let go all at once. You only need to notice when you're no longer tightening. When you're no longer correcting the moment. When you're simply here. That's not emptiness. That's you, without the constant need to hold yourself together. And that is not something to fear. It's something to grow into.